Mr. James Carter had worked in the same tall glass building for almost 35 years. Every morning, before the sun had fully risen, he would arrive in his worn but clean uniform, carrying the same old metal keys and pushing his mop bucket. Through the quiet, echoing halls, most people barely noticed him. To the busy executives and sharp-suited managers, he was just the custodian, the man who emptied the trash cans, swept the floors, and made sure the restrooms stayed clean. He never seemed in a hurry. His movements were steady, unshaken, like he had all the time in the world. Some employees would nod politely as they passed him. Others didn't even make eye contact. It never seemed to bother James. He would smile, tip his head slightly, and continue with his work. He had a kind of calm about him, the kind of calm that made the chaos of the workplace seem far away. But behind that calm was a man with a story, one that no one in the building knew anymore. A long time ago, James had been more than just a custodian. In fact, many years back, when this company was still small, James had been one of the people who helped it grow. He had sat in rooms with founders and early investors, spoken about plans and numbers, and made decisions that shaped the business in its early years. But life has a way of changing things. A personal tragedy struck James's family, one so deep that it made him step away from the corporate world entirely. He never told anyone in the building about that chapter of his life. And so, over the years, the story of who he used to be faded until he was just Mr. Carter, the janitor. Still, James didn't carry any bitterness. He loved the quiet of the early mornings, when the city outside was still waking up and the office lights were just beginning to flicker on. He liked how he could move through the building unnoticed, observing everything without anyone realizing. He knew which executives were secretly kind and which ones were cruel to those they thought were beneath them. He saw who stayed late, working hard, and who spent their time looking busy while doing very little. James kept all these observations to himself, never gossiping, never making trouble. Every Friday, he would take a short lunch in the small break room on the lower floor. A few friendly employees from the mailroom or security would sometimes join him. They liked talking to him because he listened more than he spoke, and when he did say something, it was usually worth hearing. His words were simple but sharp, the kind that made you think long after the conversation ended. Outside of work, James lived a quiet life in a small, neat house on the edge of the city. He read books, not just about cleaning or maintenance, but about history, finance, and even leadership. He kept up with business news more than most of the company's own managers. He knew the numbers the company was reporting each quarter. He knew when the stock was rising and when it was falling. But he never said a word to anyone about it. Some newer employees wondered why a man like James, so clearly intelligent and well-spoken when he did talk, had chosen to be a custodian for so long. But no one ever asked him directly, they assumed. It was all he could do, and James never bothered to correct them. Let them think what they want, he thought. There were a few who treated him with genuine respect. The security guard on night duty always greeted him warmly. The older receptionist sometimes saved him a slice of cake from the office parties he wasn't invited to. These small gestures didn't go unnoticed by James. What did go unnoticed, though, was how much he still paid attention to the company itself. He knew about the recent problems, the falling profits, the bad deals, the way some executives were pushing the wrong strategies just to save their own positions. He had heard the whispers when they thought no one was listening. Knew the trouble was getting worse. But James was not a man who acted in a rush. He believed in timing, in waiting until the right moment to speak. And until that moment came, he would keep sweeping the floors, fixing the leaky pipes, making sure the offices stayed spotless. He had seen a lot of people come and go over the decades. Young interns who thought they would run the company. One day, experienced managers who thought they knew it all. Acha! Executives with expensive suits and loud voices. Some rose, some fell, and some left without a trace. Through it all, James remained steady, patient, unnoticed. But what no one in the shiny corner offices realized was that James knew the company better than they did. He knew its history, its strengths, its weaknesses. He knew how it could be saved, and he knew who was quietly pushing it toward collapse. He had the knowledge, the experience, and the courage to speak up if he ever chose to. For now, though, he was simply the old black custodian who showed up every day, nodded politely, and did his work without complaint. And maybe that was why, when the day finally came for him to walk into that board meeting, no one saw it coming. They would laugh at first. Oh, they would laugh. But James Carter was about to remind them that appearances can be deceiving, and that the quiet man in the hallway might just be the one who knows how to save it all. The news came to James Carter in the most unexpected way. It was a Tuesday morning, the kind of morning where the sky was pale and the city seemed half asleep. James had just finished mopping the marble lobby floor when he noticed the CEO's young assistant, Olivia, rushing toward him. She was holding a small white envelope with the company logo stamped in gold. "Mr. Carter," she said, slightly out of breath, "the board wants to see you. In the main conference room, 10 o'clock sharp." James raised his eyebrows. In 35 years of working in this building, he had never once been called to the boardroom. Custodians didn't get invited to those meetings. In fact, the only time he had been inside that room was to clean it after hours, when the big leather chairs were empty. The polished table gleamed, and the faint smell of coffee and cigar smoke lingered in the air. "Are you sure, James?" asked. His voice was calm, but his mind was already wondering. Olivia nodded. "It's in writing. You're on the list for the meeting. Don't be late." She handed him the envelope and hurried off before he could ask another question. Inside the envelope was a single piece of paper. The words were simple. "Mr. James Carter requested presence at Board of Directors emergency meeting. 10 o'clock a.m. James stared at it for a moment. Requested presence. Emergency meeting. He couldn't remember the last time the company called an emergency board meeting. Something big was happening. By the time 10 o'clock approached, James had finished his morning rounds. He thought briefly about changing into a suit. He still had one at home, though it hadn't been worn in years, but the meeting was in less than 20 minutes. And besides, they had called him as he was, not as they imagined him to be. So he simply rinsed his hands, checked that his shirt was neat, and pushed his mop bucket down the hall toward the elevator. When the elevator doors opened onto the top floor, James stepped into a different world. The upper level of the building was where the real power sat. Thick carpet that muffled footsteps. Walls lined with expensive art, and the faint, expensive smell of imported coffee. Two security guards stood outside the boardroom doors. They looked at him, then at each other, and one of them smirked. "You here to fix the air conditioning?" The guard asked. James just held up the envelope. "I'm here for the meeting." The smirk vanished, replaced by mild surprise. Without another word, they opened the heavy wooden doors. The boardroom was just as James remembered. Long, glossy table, 12 tall chairs, sunlight streaming in through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city skyline glittered in the distance. Around the table sat a dozen executives, all in tailored suits. Most were in their 40s or 50s, a few older, and every one of them wore the confident look of people used to being in charge. At the head of the table was the CEO, Mr. Harris, a man with silver hair and a reputation for being tough but fair. As James stepped inside, the room went strangely quiet for half a second. Then came the chuckles. One man near the end of the table whispered loudly to another, "Guess someone's here to clean up our mess," literally. Another said, "Didn't realize we were bringing in the maintenance department for strategic advice." A few outright laughed, covering their mouths with their hands like school children. The sound echoed against the polished wood and glass. "James, didn't react. He had been underestimated before, and he knew better than to rise to the bait. Instead, he calmly parked his mop bucket by the door, walked toward the empty chair nearest the end of the table, and sat down without being told. The laughter faded, replaced by a few puzzled looks. The CEO cleared his throat. "Mr. Carter," he said, "thank you for joining us on short notice." James nodded politely. "Of course. You may be wondering why you're here," Harris continued. "This company is facing serious challenges: financial instability, shareholder pressure, and a potential leadership crisis. You have been with this company longer than almost anyone in this room. I thought it was time you joined the conversation." Some of the executives shifted in their chairs, clearly unhappy with the idea. A woman in a sharp navy suit leaned toward her neighbor and muttered something James didn't catch, but he could guess the tone as the meeting began. Charts and reports flashed on the wall screen. The discussion quickly grew heated. Executives argued over numbers, over who was to blame, over whether to cut jobs or sell assets. James stayed silent, listening to every word. His eyes moved from face to face, catching the nervous glances, the defensive tones. It was the same kind of panic he had seen decades ago, back when the company was still small. The difference was, back then, they had been willing to listen to solutions. Now, they were too busy protecting their own positions. One point. An executive named Mr. Klein looked directly at him. "Do you even understand any of this, Carter? No offense, but board-level strategy isn't exactly mopped bucket territory." The room laughed again, though less loudly this time. James leaned back in his chair and gave a slow smile. "Oh, I understand," he said. "I understand a lot more than you think." The tone of his voice, calm, steady, but carrying weight, made a few people glance at him differently. He didn't say more just yet. Timing was everything, and James Carter knew that the right moment was coming. The laughter in the boardroom hung in the air like a bad smell. It wasn't the loud, joyous laughter of friends sharing a joke. It was sharper, meant to cut. Some of the executives chuckled behind their hands. Others didn't bother to hide their smirks. They weren't laughing at a joke. They were laughing at him. James Carter sat still, his back straight, his face calm. He had been around long enough to know that people who laughed at you were usually trying to cover their own fear, or at the very least, their insecurity. Mr. Klein, the man who had questioned whether James understood board-level strategy, leaned forward, elbows on the table. "I mean, really, Harris?" he said to the CEO. "With all due respect, we have serious issues to discuss. Are we really going to waste valuable time on?" "What? A motivational speech from the janitor?" Several others snorted in agreement. One younger executive, a man barely in his 30s, smirked and said, "Maybe he's here to teach us how to sweep up bad decisions." The room erupted again in laughter, though this time it was smaller, shorter. Some of them were laughing because they thought they were being clever, but others were watching James now, curious about why he wasn't reacting. James slowly turned his head toward the young man who had just spoken. "Young fella," he said quietly, "do you know how many bad decisions I've had to sweep up in this company? More than you've had birthdays." The laughter stopped, not because the words were sharp, but because of the way James said them. Calm, matter of fact, like a man stating the weather. The young executive's smirk faded. He looked down at his notes. The CEO, Harris, gave a small, amused smile, but didn't interrupt. He had seen this before. The quiet man in the corner, who knew more than he let on. Harris had invited James for a reason, even if the rest of the board didn't understand it yet. The meeting rolled on. They went through budget projections, shareholder complaints, and a report on the company's falling stock price. Voices were raised, fingers were pointed. Some wanted to cut staff to save money. Others wanted to sell off smaller divisions. James listened, saying nothing. He didn't even glance at the presentation slides on the screen. Instead, he focused on the people. The way Klein's jaw tightened whenever certain numbers were mentioned. The way another board member, Mrs. West, avoided making eye contact when the conversation turned to overseas contracts. James had learned long ago that the truth wasn't always in the documents. It was in the way people acted when the pressure was on. Eventually, Klein turned back to him. "You've been awfully quiet, Carter," he said with a mocking grin. "Nothing to add? Or are we still waiting for that big janitorial insight?" James finally leaned forward, resting his hands on the table. "Let me ask you something, Mr. Klein," he said evenly. "How much does the company spend each month maintaining those overseas warehouses you signed off on 2 years ago?" Klein's grin faltered. "That's not relevant." "It's relevant," James interrupted, his voice still calm but firmer now, "'cause those warehouses are bleeding money. I read the last financial report. You've got storage sitting half empty in 3 different countries, costing the company millions while your sales team can't fill the orders you already have." The room went quiet. "How do you know about that?" Mrs. West asked, narrowing her eyes. James looked at her. "Because I've been here long enough to see the same mistakes being made again and again. Different names, different faces, same problems. And I've been paying attention while you've been too busy arguing about whose seat at this table is bigger." Harris raised an eyebrow but didn't stop him. James continued, "I've walked these halls for decades. I've seen every department. I talk to the people you ignore, the ones who actually keep this company running. The warehouse managers, the clerks, the tech guys in the basement fixing your systems at midnight. I've heard their frustrations, their warnings. The same warnings you've dismissed in these very meetings." There was a shift in the room now. Some of the executives avoided looking at him altogether. Others looked at him like they were. Seeing him for the first time, Klein tried to recover his composure. "That's all well and good, Carter, but walking around with a mop doesn't make you an expert on corporate strategy." James allowed himself the faintest smile. "No," he said. "But once upon a time, running this company's finances did." The words landed like a hammer. There was a murmur around the table. Klein's eyes widened. "You," he started. "That's right," James said, his voice low but steady. "Before half of you even knew this company existed, I was here. I helped build its financial backbone. I wrote some of the very procedures you're still using today. And I stepped away for personal reasons. I didn't stop caring. I just stopped sitting at this table." Silence filled the room. No one laughed now. Even the CEO sat back, letting the weight of the moment hang. James glanced around the table, meeting the eyes of each person who had mocked him earlier. "You think because I clean floors, I don't see the cracks in the foundation, but I've been watching the walls lean for years. And if you don't start listening, really listening, this whole building is going to collapse. Not just the floors I mop." The boardroom was still. No one dared to laugh again. James leaned back in his chair, his point made. He wasn't just the old custodian anymore. He was someone they couldn't ignore. The air in the boardroom felt heavier now. The laughter was gone. The smirks had faded. For the first time since James Carter walked into the meeting. Every pair of eyes was on him, not with mockery, but with a growing sense of unease. James didn't rush. He let the silence stretch, like a teacher waiting for the class to settle before speaking. He had learned long ago that silence could be more powerful than words. Finally, he leaned forward, his rough hands folded neatly on the glossy table. "You've been talking about cutting jobs," he began, his voice calm but carrying weight. "You've been talking about selling off parts of this company to make the numbers look better for the next quarterly report. But that's not a solution. That's a bandage over a deep wound. Some of the executives shifted in their seats. "I've seen this before," James continued. "Decades ago, when this company was still a small operation, we had a crisis just like this. Sales were falling, morale was low, and the people at the top were ready to gut the business just to survive. But we didn't survive by cutting away the heart of the company. We survived by fixing what was broken and by listening to the people who actually knew the work." Mrs. West frowned. "And what exactly do you think is broken, Mr. Carter?" she asked, her tone polite but skeptical. James met her gaze. "For starters, those overseas warehouses Klein signed off on." Klein stiffened. "They're in the wrong locations," James said. "Too far from your main suppliers, too expensive to maintain, and not producing the output they were supposed to. Your own logistics team warned against them, but their reports were buried because it didn't fit the expansion plan someone wanted to brag about in last year's investor meeting." Klein opened his mouth to protest, but James held up a hand. "Don't bother denying it. I've seen the numbers. I've talked to the warehouse managers. Half of your inventory sits untouched because you're shipping products across oceans, twice instead of delivering directly to the customer base." He turned to Mrs. West. "Then there's the overseas contract. You negotiated the one you keep calling a strategic partnership. The terms are so lopsided in their favor that we lose money on every unit sold. The production delays from their end. They're not accidents. They're squeezing us to renegotiate under pressure." Mrs. West's lips tightened. James looked around the table. "These are not small mistakes. They're bleeding this company dry. And you all know it. You've just been too busy arguing over who's to blame to admit it." The CEO, Harris, sat back in his chair, saying nothing. His sharp eyes flicked between James and the others, watching the power shift in the room. James went on, his tone never rising, but his words cutting deeper. "You think I'm just the man who cleans your offices? But I've been here long enough to see everything, every department, every process, every piece of gossip you don't think matters. I know which departments are understaffed because upper management thinks saving pennies now is smarter than keeping talent. I know which suppliers have been overcharging you for years because no one bothers to compare the invoices anymore." One of the younger board members, a woman named Evelyn, leaned forward. "If you know all this, Mr. Carter, what would you do differently?" James nodded slightly. He'd been waiting for that question. "First," he said, "I'd cut those warehouse losses immediately. Sell or close the facilities that aren't worth the cost. Second, I'd pull the overseas contract off the table until we have leverage. And that means finding alternate suppliers now, before they realize we're desperate. Third, I'd invest in the teams that are actually bringing in revenue instead of draining them to make the budget look better on paper. And fourth," he let the pause hang in the air, "I'd start running this company with the same respect you expect for yourselves. Because the people below you see everything, and they're the ones holding it together while you argue in here." The room was silent. Some of the executives looked guilty. Others looked furious. Klein's face was flushed. "You make it sound so simple," he said, his voice tight. "It's not simple," James replied. "It's work. Hard work. And that's why it's not getting done, because too many of you are more worried about appearances than results." Evelyn glanced at the CEO. "He's not wrong," she said quietly. Harris finally spoke. "No, he's not." His voice carried a mix of approval and warning. "And maybe it's time we stop underestimating the people who've been here longer than we have." James leaned back in his chair. Not triumphant, not smug, just steady. "I'm not here for a title or for credit. I'm here because I care what happens to this company. I've cared since the first day it opened its doors. But caring without speaking up is as bad as not caring at all. So now, I'm speaking. There was no more laughter in the boardroom. The old custodian had just taken control of the conversation, and everyone knew it. But this was only the beginning. What came next would decide whether his words changed anything, or whether the people in that room would fight to silence him again. The tension in the boardroom had shifted. When James first walked in, he was the man nobody took seriously. Now, he was the one everyone was watching. Even the CEO, Harris, kept his focus locked on him, as if waiting for whatever was coming next. James knew this was the moment. If he wanted them to truly listen, not just out of curiosity, but with real respect, he would have to show them why his words carried weight. He took a slow breath and began. Some of you are wondering how I know so much about this company. Why a custodian is speaking to you like this. Klein shifted in his seat, muttering under his breath. We're all wondering that. James ignored the comment. His eyes stayed steady. It's because I've been here before, he said. Not just in this building, in this very room. Not as a guest, not as a janitor, but as one of you. There was a ripple of surprise. Evelyn blinked. Mrs. West's pen froze mid-note. A few of the older board members exchanged looks, as if trying to remember something buried deep in the company's history. James leaned forward slightly. 32 years ago, I sat at this table as Chief Financial Officer. I was here when we were still renting 2 small offices downtown. I was here when we took our first big loan, when we landed our first international deal. I helped design the accounting systems you still use today. I negotiated contracts that kept us alive during our first real crisis. I know this company from the ground up because I was here when the ground was still dirt. He paused, letting the words sink in. Klein let out a short, disbelieving laugh. If that's true, why in the world are you pushing a mop now? James's expression didn't change, because life doesn't ask for your permission before it changes everything. The room went quiet again. My wife got sick, James said, his voice steady but softer now, and not the kind of sick you can recover from. I could have stayed in this seat, kept making the big decisions, kept building this company. But I would have been building it while watching the woman I loved fade away. And that wasn't a price I was willing to pay, so I stepped down. I took a job that would let me be home when she needed me. A job that kept me close enough to still watch over the company I'd poured my life into. No one spoke. The sound of the city traffic faintly echoed from beyond the windows. James went on. She passed 15 years ago. I stayed on as custodian because I didn't need more. I didn't need the title. Didn't need the money. I just wanted to keep walking these halls, seeing the place we built still standing. He glanced toward Harris, and to be honest, I figured the new leadership would take care of it. I figured the company was in good hands. He let his eyes sweep the table, his voice sharpening again. But over the years, I watched the cracks grow, and I stayed quiet, too quiet. I told myself it wasn't my business anymore, but seeing what's happening now? I can't sit on my hands while the whole thing crumbles. Evelyn leaned forward. You mean to say you've been here all these years, with that kind of knowledge, and you've just been watching? Yes, James said plainly, because it wasn't my place. Until now. Klein's face was tight, but there was less arrogance in it now. He looked uncomfortable, maybe even ashamed. Mrs. West cleared her throat. I remember. Now, she said slowly. I was an intern here when I first heard your name. The older staff used to talk about you, said you were one of the smartest men in the building. I thought you'd retired. James gave a small smile. I guess you could say I did. I just never left. Harris finally spoke. Mr. Carter, why speak now? Why not 5 years ago? Or 10? Because 5 years ago, this was still fixable without a fight. James replied, "Now, it's a fight, and you need someone who's not afraid to throw the first punch. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why I'm here today. You've ignored the quiet voices in this company for too long. You've trusted too much, too. Numbers on paper, and not enough to the people who know the work." He leaned back in his chair. "I may push a mop now, but don't think for a second I've forgotten how to run this company better than half the people sitting here." The words settled like heavy stones in the room. For the first time, the board wasn't just listening. They were looking at James as if he truly belonged at the table. And James knew he had just placed the first brick in the foundation of Cal. What was coming next? The boardroom was silent. It wasn't the awkward silence of people who didn't know what to say. It was the heavy, tense silence of people realizing they had underestimated the wrong man. James Carter sat back in his chair, his expression calm, almost unreadable. Inside, though, he could feel the shift. He had spent decades blending into the background, a part of the building's furniture. Now, the eyes that once slid past him without notice were fixed on him, searching for answers, trying to piece together the truth of who he really was. Klein was the first to break the quiet, his voice lower and less sure than before. "All right, suppose we believe you. Suppose you were CFO all those years ago. What exactly do you expect from us now? You want a seat back at this table? You want control?" James shook his head. "I don't want a seat. I don't need control. I want this company to survive, to thrive. That's all. But for that to happen, you're going to have to start doing something you're not used to doing." He let the words hang in the air. Listening, Mrs. West crossed her arms. "And I suppose you think you have all the answers?" James met her gaze without flinching. "No, but I have enough of the right ones to get us back on track. And I'm not blinded by ego or the need to please investors at the expense of the company's health. You can't say the same for everyone at this table." Her lips tightened, but she didn't argue. Harris, the CEO, spoke up, his voice thoughtful. "James, let's say we give you the floor. Let's say we hear your plan. You've already named a few mistakes, the warehouses, the contracts, the staffing cuts. But those are symptoms. What's the disease?" James leaned forward. "Disease," he said, "is short-term thinking. You've been running this company like a man bailing water out of a sinking boat instead of patching the hole in the hull. Every decision you've made in the last 5 years has been about survival for the next quarter. Instead of stability for the next decade, you've stopped building. You've stopped innovating. And worse, you've stopped trusting the people who actually keep this place running." Evelyn nodded slightly. "So what do you suggest?" James tapped the table with one hand, slow and deliberate. "First, you stop the bleeding. That means cutting bad investments now, not in 6 months, not in a year. Second, you rebuild trust with your workforce. Stop treating them like numbers on a spreadsheet and start treating them like partners. You'll be surprised how quickly that turns into better performance. Third," he glanced around the table, "you start listening to the people who've been ignored. You'd be amazed what you can learn from a warehouse supervisor, a sales clerk, or yes, even a custodian, if you bother to ask." Klein let out a slow breath. "And if we don't," James's eyes were steady, "then you won't have a company left to argue about." The words landed hard. No one laughed this time. No one smirked. There was a long pause. Then Harris did something James hadn't expected. The CEO pushed back his chair slightly and gestured toward him. "The floor is yours, Mr. Carter." James glanced around the table. "You sure about that?" Harris nodded. "I am." James took a deep breath. For years, he had been silent, watching mistakes pile up like dust in an empty office. Now, he had the chance to speak, really speak, and he wasn't going to waste it. He began to outline his plan. not with flashy language or empty promises, but with clear, concrete steps. Every point he made was backed by examples, numbers, and first-hand accounts from the people inside the company. He spoke of efficiency, of rebuilding customer trust, of cutting unnecessary spending while investing in areas that would grow revenue long-term. The more he spoke, the more the tension in the room shifted again. The defensiveness faded from some faces. Others still looked skeptical, but they were listening. For the first time in years, James Carter was no longer invisible. He was the voice they couldn't ignore, the one they didn't know they needed until it was almost too late. And, as he spoke, a thought came to him, quiet but certain. This isn't the end of my story here. This is the beginning of the next chapter. When James Carter finished speaking, the room was still for several seconds. Not the awkward kind of silence. This was the heavy kind. The kind that comes when everyone knows a decision is about to be made that will change everything. Harris, the CEO, was the first to break it. "You've given us a lot to think about, James," he said slowly, his fingers tapping lightly on the table. "But this is an emergency meeting. Thinking won't save us. Action will." He looked around. The table at the other board members. "We have two choices. We can continue as we have been, patching holes, chasing quick wins, pretending the problems aren't as bad as they are. Or we can do something bold, something uncomfortable." Klein frowned. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Harris leaned back slightly, but his eyes stayed sharp. "I'm suggesting we put Carter in charge of executing the turnaround plan." The reaction was instant. Klein sat upright. Mrs. West's pen dropped onto the table. A few board members exchanged stunned looks. Evelyn's eyes widened, but she didn't look surprised. She looked almost relieved. Klein was the first to speak. "This is ridiculous. We can't just hand the reins to someone who hasn't been in the corporate game for decades." James didn't flinch. "If the corporate game is what got you here, maybe it's time you tried something else." That line hit harder than he expected. Evelyn actually smiled faintly. Mrs. West cleared her throat. "Look, I'm not saying Carter's wrong about the problems. He's obviously been paying attention. But we can't ignore the fact that this will send shockwaves through the company, the shareholders, the press." Harris nodded. "I'm aware. But if we keep doing what we've been doing, we won't have to worry about the shareholders or the press. There won't be a company for them to talk about." The debate began in earnest. Some argued that it was too risky. Others said Carter's fresh perspective might be exactly what they needed. The voices rose, tension building again. Through it all, James remained quiet, listening. Just as he had done in the first half of the meeting. Finally, when there was a pause, he spoke. "I'm not asking for a title. I'm not asking for a paycheck. I'm offering to guide you through the storm, nothing more. You can call it an advisory role, call it whatever you want. But I'm telling you, if you want to save this company, you can't keep letting the same people make the same mistakes over and over again." The room went quiet again. This time, it was Harris who leaned forward. "I'll put it to a vote," he said. "All in favor of giving Carter full authority to implement a 6-month turnaround plan under my supervision, but with no interference from the rest of you." Hands began to rise one by one. Evelyn's went up first, then Mrs. West's. 2 more followed. Klein's hand stayed firmly on the table, his jaw tight. But James noticed he didn't look as confident as before. When the count was done, the decision was clear. The majority was in favor. Harris turned to James. "Looks like you're officially in." James nodded slowly. "Then, let's get to work." Klein muttered something under his breath, but James ignored him. He wasn't here to win over every ego in the room. He was here to save the company. And he knew that the real work, the hard work, was only beginning. But there was something else in the air now. Something James hadn't felt in a long time. Momentum. The tide was turning, and this time he was steering it. Outside the boardroom, the hallway was quiet, the world unaware of what had just happened inside. James knew that by the time word spread, the story would sound unbelievable. The old custodian walked into a board meeting and walked out in charge of saving the company. But he didn't care how it sounded. What mattered was that it was true, and for the first time in years, James Carter felt exactly where he was meant to be. Asterisk, the next 6 months were unlike anything the company had seen in years. When James Carter walked out of that boardroom with the authority to execute his turnaround plan, some employees didn't believe it. They thought it was a rumor, an office joke. But they quickly learned it was real, and James wasn't wasting a single day. He didn't sit in an office on the top floor like most executives. Instead, he spent his days walking through every department, talking to people at every level. He visited the warehouses, met with customer service teams, sat down with the IT crew in the basement, and even joined the night shift to see how things worked when the executives were gone. At first, people were nervous to speak openly, afraid their honesty might be used against them. But they quickly learned that James wasn't there to punish. He was there to listen. And when they told him what was wrong, he actually fixed it. One warehouse manager told him about shipments being delayed because of unnecessary overseas routing. Within 2 weeks, James had rerouted the entire supply chain, saving millions. A junior accountant showed him how certain contracts were draining money instead of making it. James personally renegotiated them, putting the company back into profit. On those deals, the news began to spread through the building. The old custodian was fixing things no one else could. Meanwhile, the board watched in cautious disbelief. Harris kept his promise to let James operate without interference, and each month the numbers spoke for themselves. Losses began shrinking. Customer satisfaction scores went up. Staff turnover dropped because employees finally felt heard and valued. Even Klein, the man who had mocked him the most, had to admit, quietly, that James's changes were working. He never said it to James's face, but his tone in meetings softened. By the 5th month, the company was no longer just surviving, it was growing again. The stock price climbed, and investors who had been ready to pull out were suddenly eager to double down. The press picked up the story, though the company's PR department kept James's past role as CFO quiet. To the public, he was simply a senior advisor brought in to help steer the company back on track. But inside the building, everyone knew the truth. On the final day of his 6-month agreement, James called a meeting, not with the board, but with the staff. The cafeteria was packed, with people spilling into the hallways just to hear him speak. He stood at the front, wearing the same neat custodian's uniform he'd worn for decades. No suit, no tie, just James. I came into that boardroom a year ago because I couldn't stand by and watch this place fall apart, he said. I didn't do it alone. Every change we made, every problem we solved, it came from listening to you. From the people who know the work, who care about doing it right. If there's one thing you remember from all this, let it be this: you matter. Every single one of you. There was a long round of applause, but James lifted a hand for quiet. I'm stepping back now, he said. The company's on steady ground again. My work here is done. And tomorrow morning, I'll be back too. My regular duties, just like before. Someone in the crowd shouted, "You saved us, James!" And the room erupted into cheers. Harris, standing in the back, smiled faintly. He knew James could have taken a high-ranking position again if he wanted, but that wasn't who James was. The next morning, James was back in the lobby at sunrise, mop bucket by his side, greeting employees as they came in. But now, when they passed him, they didn't just nod politely or ignore him. They shook his hand, they thanked him, Some even called him Mr. Carter, with a new kind of respect in their voice. He had gone into that boardroom as the man everyone overlooked. He came out as the man who had saved the company, and James Carter. He was perfectly fine going back to being just the custodian. Because he knew the truth. The people who mattered knew it too.